To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven. And there are silences that cannot be logically explained, because they do not arise from absence, but from depth. They are not voids, they are spaces. Spaces where something is being formed away from eyes, away from haste, away from the human need to understand everything before trusting. God's silence makes us uncomfortable because it breaks a very common expectation, the idea that clarity must always come before the step. But in faith, it is almost never like that. From the beginning of biblical history, God does not reveal himself as a narrator who delivers the complete script. He reveals himself as a voice that calls, that invites, that awakens inner stirrings. And that stirring is often the first sign of a call. It does not come with applause. It does not come with absolute certainties. It comes as a persistent feeling that something no longer fits, that staying the same costs more than changing, even if the change is not yet clear. The problem is that the human mind has been trained to seek control. We want maps, dates, guarantees. We want to know exactly where we are going before taking the first step. But God works with another kind of logic. He first forms the internal structure before revealing the external destination. Because there are places, responsibilities, and levels of purpose that can only be sustained by someone who has already been worked on from within. That is why silence is not punishment. It is care, it is protection. Revealing too soon can inflate the ego, generate fear, or provoke hasty decisions. There are truths that are only understood after going through the process, not before. And when God is silent, it is not because he has moved away, but because he is operating on a deeper layer, that of character, patience, and mature faith. Perhaps today you are not waiting for answers. Perhaps you are being prepared to sustain them. And that preparation almost always happens away from the noise, away from external validation, away from immediate approval. It happens in that uncomfortable place where only those who are willing to trust without seeing the entire path remain. That is the point where many retreat, not because they lack capacity, but because they cannot tolerate waiting. Because silence demands something that few want to offer, surrender without control. There is a silent moment in life when you can no longer pretend you don't know. It's not total confusion, nor is it full clarity. It is that uncomfortable intermediate point where consciousness begins to weigh. You know something is pending. You know there's a postponed decision, an avoided direction, an internal conversation you've tried to silence. And yet you go on as if nothing is happening. But inside something insists. Many people are not lost. They are deliberately delayed. Not because they lack capacity, but because facing the call requires breaking with old versions of themselves. It demands admitting that certain cycles have ended, even if the next one is not yet fully defined. And that's scary, because the mind prefers a familiar cage to uncertain freedom. Perhaps you compare yourself to others. You see others' progress and wonder why yours seems so slow. But not all processes unfold in plain sight. There are formations that happen in secret, and what is formed in silence usually has deeper roots than what grows quickly. The anxiety you feel is not always a sign of error. Sometimes it's a sign of growth. When consciousness expands, it no longer tolerates what once seemed normal. What once fit now weighs. What once served now causes discomfort. And that discomfort is not punishment, it's an invitation. God usually doesn't shout when he calls. He whispers, and whispering demands attention. It demands stillness. It demands inner honesty. That's why many people prefer noise. Noise distracts, anesthetizes, justifies procrastination. But when the noise fades, the truth remains. Perhaps you've been saying not yet, later, when I'm ready. But preparation doesn't always come before the decision. Often, the decision is what activates the preparation. Waiting to feel completely secure can become an elegant way to remain stuck. And here a difficult truth appears. Not all delays come from God. Some delays stem from the fear of taking responsibility. Because when the call becomes clear, there are no more excuses. And embracing a call always transforms life, even when we don't yet know how. If this point makes you a little uncomfortable, don't ignore it. Well understood discomfort is a sign that something true is being touched. And what is touched by truth sooner or later demands a response. In biblical history, there is a pattern that repeats with unsettling precision. God rarely reveals the complete plan at the beginning, not because he enjoys hiding, but because he understands something that the human mind usually ignores. Revelation without preparation can destroy more than it builds. Therefore, before showing the destination, God works on the interior. Before providing clarity, he forms character. Before opening doors, he strengthens the structure that will sustain what is to come. Abraham did not receive a map, he received an invitation. Leave your land, without coordinates, without visible guarantees, without immediate promises of comfort. Moses was called when he still doubted his own voice. Joseph dreamed of greatness, but was sent to silence, injustice, and oblivion before he was to govern. None of them received complete explanations. They received enough light for the next step and nothing more. That nothing more is what makes us uncomfortable, because the mind wants the end before walking through the middle. It wants results before processes. It wants security before surrender. But faith doesn't work that way. Mature faith is built when you learn to move forward with limited information, trusting not in what you see, but in who guides you. God's silence then is not emptiness. It is strategy. It is protection. There are truths that, if revealed too soon, would feed ego, not obedience. There are destinies that, if shown completely from the beginning, would generate anxiety, not commitment. That's why God reveals in stages. Because each stage forms something essential: patience, humility, discernment, emotional resilience. Many people interpret silence as rejection. They think, if God doesn't answer me, maybe it's not for me. But silence, in many cases, is a sign that the process has already begun. When God ignores, he doesn't form. When God forms, he sometimes remains silent. And that silence is active, not passive. It is shaping reactions, cleansing motivations, aligning intentions. Here is a difficult truth. God does not speed up processes just to alleviate human anxiety. He prioritizes the integrity of the calling over emotional urgency. Because a poorly sustained calling becomes a burden, and a destiny reached without maturity turns into a weight. Understanding this changes your stance. You stop demanding explanations and start observing yourself. You stop asking for external signs and begin to develop internal sensitivity. You learn to distinguish between impulse and direction, between desire and purpose. And that discernment is not taught in a day. It is formed in waiting. Perhaps that is why there are no clear answers today. Not because they don't exist, but because you are still being prepared to sustain them without breaking. And when that preparation reaches its point, clarity comes, not all at once, but in the exact measure you need to move forward with firmness. Waiting is not just a spiritual issue, it is deeply psychological. The human mind was designed to seek predictability, control, and security. When it doesn't find them, it enters a state of alert. Repetitive thoughts, constant comparisons, imaginary scenarios, and an urgent need to resolve what is not yet ready to be resolved arise. That's why waiting hurts. Not because it's empty, but because it directly confronts our need for control. When God is silent, the mind tries to fill that space with noise. Mental noise, emotional noise, external noise. We fill ourselves with distractions, other people's opinions, constant activity. Not because we are moving forward, but because we are afraid of standing still in front of what is being worked on inside us. Silence forces us to look inward, and not everyone is prepared for that encounter. From a psychological perspective, tolerance for uncertainty is one of the most important emotional skills for maturity. People who cannot stand not knowing tend to make hasty decisions, not out of conviction, but out of relief. They prefer a wrong answer over an uncomfortable wait. But momentary relief almost always comes at a price later on. Well-navigated waiting develops something rare in these times: discernment. Discernment is not guessing. It is perceiving with internal clarity, even when external circumstances are undefined. And that kind of clarity is not born from haste, but from patient observation. The mind quiets, emotions order themselves, and internal noise begins to diminish. Not because there are answers, but because there is maturity. Many people confuse waiting with passivity, but transformative waiting is active. It is a time of internal adjustment, of reviewing motivations, of aligning what is desired with what one is truly willing to sustain. Because not everything we want are we prepared to live. And God does not deliver destinies that destroy those who receive them. Here an uncomfortable truth arises. There are people who fail, not because God has not called them, but because they did not respect the process that was preparing them. They skipped stages, they forced doors. They rushed times, and what arrived without roots did not last. Waiting, then, is not punishment. It is protection against collapse. Perhaps today you feel that your life is on pause. But pause does not mean stagnation. It means reconfiguration. It's the moment when invisible structures are strengthened. Patience, humility, the ability to listen, clarity of intention. These are the structures that will sustain future decisions so that you do not break along the way. If you understand this, something changes. You stop fighting against waiting and begin to learn from it. You stop demanding immediate answers and start observing what is being transformed within you. And when that transformation reaches the necessary point, the next step becomes evident, not because everything is clear, but because you are now prepared to move forward without depending on absolute certainties. There is a point in the process where silence ceases to be just waiting and becomes a mirror. It no longer reveals only what God is forming, but what you are avoiding. Because while some people wait for instructions, others wait for permission. And there are callings that do not advance, because deep down, the person has not yet decided to assume the weight that calling implies. Perhaps you are not lacking answers. Perhaps you have too much awareness. You know more than you admit. You intuit more than you verbalize. And that insistent intuition does not come to torment you, but to confront you with a simple and profound truth. When the calling becomes clear, responsibility becomes inevitable. And not everyone is willing to pay that price. This is where many stop, not out of incapacity, but out of fear of transformation. Because responding to a calling is not adding something to life, it is reorganizing it. It is leaving behind certain versions of oneself that no longer fit the new direction. It is accepting that some comforts, relationships, or habits will have to be reviewed. And that is more uncomfortable than waiting. Silence then fulfills another function. It exposes excuses. As long as everything seems indefinite, there is always room to postpone. But when consciousness awakens, one can no longer feign ignorance. And pretending is tiring. It tires the soul. It tires the mind. It tires the heart. That is why prolonged procrastination often leads to internal wear and tear. Not all delays come from God. Some delays arise from the resistance to assume emotional and spiritual responsibility. Because moving forward requires commitment, and commitment requires constancy. It requires showing up even when there are no applause, continuing even when there are no external confirmations, trusting even when the result is not immediate. Here is a truth that is rarely stated clearly. God does not force callings. He invites, and the invitation can be accepted or ignored. Silence is not always a sign to wait. Sometimes it is an opportunity to decide. Decide to stop fleeing, stop negotiating internally, stop asking for more signs when the direction is already sufficient. If this part makes you a little uncomfortable, do not reject it. Discomfort can also be a form of honesty. It is the point where faith ceases to be theory and begins to become practice, where waiting ceases to be passive and transforms into internal positioning. Perhaps today it is not about understanding more, but about assuming what you have already understood. And that step, though silent, changes the entire direction of the process. There's something few people understand about wisdom. It doesn't arrive as a sudden revelation that orders everything at once. It arrives as a process, a discrete, constant, almost invisible process to those looking from the outside. True wisdom doesn't impose itself, it accumulates. It is formed in the repetition of small, aligned decisions, in the internal discipline of someone who chooses to move forward even when there is no emotion, even when no one is watching. That's why those who seek quick answers often get frustrated. They confuse clarity with urgency. But lasting clarity is born from structure, not impulse. The mind needs to be organized, the heart needs to be trained, and the spirit needs to learn to recognize direction in the midst of calm. None of that happens overnight. It happens when a person commits to a path, not to an event. Walking with wisdom means accepting that growth doesn't always feel inspiring. There are days when moving forward is simply staying faithful, faithful to what has already been understood, faithful to what has already been intuited, faithful to that which, even if not fully defined, is no longer optional. That daily fidelity is what transforms waiting into formation. Many expect life to change before they organize themselves internally. But order almost always begins in reverse. First, the mind is organized, then decisions become clearer. First, the inner self is aligned, then the exterior begins to respond. Not because the world adapts, but because perception changes. And when perception changes, choices also change. Wisdom doesn't shout, it doesn't pressure, it doesn't rush. It invites a more conscious, more attentive, more responsible rhythm. A rhythm that doesn't depend on constant motivation, but on silent conviction. That's why those who walk with wisdom don't need to convince anyone. Their life becomes coherent, their steps firm, their direction increasingly clear, though not completely revealed. Perhaps this is the point where many get confused. They expect an external sign when what is being offered is an internal structure. They expect a definitive answer when what is being formed is the capacity to sustain progressive answers. Because the clarity that endures does not come from a moment, but from a well-tended process. When you accept to walk this way, something changes profoundly. Anxiety diminishes, comparison loses strength, urgency gives way to constancy. And little by little, without fanfare, life begins to reflect externally the order established internally. Not because everything is resolved, but because now there is enough direction to continue. After all that has been said, an inevitable point arrives. This message ceases to be a general reflection and becomes personal. It no longer speaks of biblical stories, of external processes, or of abstract concepts. It speaks of you, of your moment, of that which, although not always in your words, lives in your consciousness. Because a calling, when true, does not hide in theories. It manifests in internal questions that do not disappear. Pause for a moment and be honest with yourself. What have you been postponing? Not what others expect of you, but that which you know requires a decision. It could be a direction, a change, a surrender, a simple obedience that you have been delaying under the excuse of "it's not yet time." But mature consciousness recognizes the difference between waiting with wisdom and postponing out of fear. There are decisions not made because of a lack of clarity, but because they demand coherence. They demand aligning thought, emotion, and action. And that alignment is uncomfortable because it forces one to stop living fragmented. It forces one to stop justifying internal contradictions. And not everyone is willing to make that move, even if they know it is necessary. Perhaps you have been waiting for a more evident external sign, when what already exists is a persistent internal confirmation. That confirmation doesn't shout, it doesn't dramatize. It simply remains, it returns again and again. It becomes present in moments of silence, in recurrent thoughts, in a feeling that continuing as before is no longer sustainable. Ignoring that doesn't make it disappear, it only postpones it. Here's something important. The calling doesn't always demand grand, immediate gestures. Sometimes it asks for a small but honest first step, a course correction, an internal decision that no one sees yet. And that step, though it seems simple, changes the entire dynamic of the process. Because when there is internal positioning, external direction begins to organize itself. It's not about answering everything today, it's about stopping the flight. About admitting to yourself what part of your life can no longer be on pause. About recognizing that waiting is not always passivity, but that constant procrastination wears you down. And that there is a clear difference between respecting time and resisting the calling. If this block makes you uncomfortable, it's a good sign. Discomfort can also be a form of truth knocking at the door. And when truth presents itself, it doesn't demand perfection, it demands honesty. That is the point where the process ceases to be abstract and begins to transform into decision. At this point, something has become clear. Silence was not emptiness. It was direction, it was not abandonment. It was formation. And now the question is no longer whether God is speaking, but what you will do with what has already been awakened within you. Because there are moments when continuing to ask for more clarity becomes a subtle way of avoiding the next step. And the next step, almost always, is internal before it is visible. You don't need to resolve your entire life today. You don't need to understand every detail of the path. What you do need is to recognize what part of you can no longer keep postponing. The calling does not demand perfection, it demands coherence. It demands that what has already been understood begins to be reflected in small, constant and aligned decisions. This coherence is what transforms waiting into real progress. If this message resonated with you, do not let it pass as just another reflection. Write in the comments what you feel you have been postponing. Naming it is an act of honesty, and honesty is the first step towards any true change. By sharing it, you not only clarify your own consciousness, but also allow others to recognize themselves in the process. I also invite you to read the pinned comment. There I left a reflection for those who wish to walk this process with more clarity and constancy, without haste, without pressure, respecting the internal time that each transformation requires. Sometimes organizing the mind and spirit day by day makes all the difference between stagnation and steady progress. Save this video. Come back to it when external noise tries to confuse you. Share it with someone who needs to hear this today. We don't always know who is going through a silence similar to ours, and a single reflection can become a turning point in another person's life. Remember, not everything is revealed at once, but everything is revealed to those who remain faithful to the process. Silence was not the end. It was the beginning of a more conscious decision.